one of the 28 regions of Malawi. There are 14 million people in Malawi. 28 regions that each have about 500,000 people, something like that in each. And one of them is Ntcheu. And we distributed enough nets to cover every single sleeping space, relatively simply, with 4 principles behind the operation that were fundamental. Firstly, that we go to every household, as I mentioned earlier, to understand how many nets people need. Now, in the case of Ntcheu, you're looking at something like 5 people per household on average, and I think there are 120,000 households. So, if you reflect for a moment, going to 120,000 households in Africa and gathering the data as to how many people in each household and how many sleeping spaces, I can imagine if you all thought, or a significant number of you thought, wow, are you biting off more than you can chew? That sounds pretty difficult. But it's not when you've got 450 health workers employed by the government. And remember, malaria is the biggest problem they have health-wise, and net's the most effective thing we can do. So those 450 health workers, under the district health officer, were allocated because, again, it's a big team effort, working with our partner Concern Universal in Malawi, who have experience in this part of the world, and they know the health system and all the malaria coordinator and the district health officer and so on and so on. Coordinated those 450 people who spent 5 days each going to, again, if you run the numbers, I think it means they go to something like 250 households each, 50 a day, and gather fabulous information that then a team of 8 people put into a database, which then gets sampled and checked to make sure the health service, the HSAs gathering the data, are doing a good job. And they were doing a fantastic job. And they were incredibly accurate with even assessing nets that were already in place and saying, that's good enough, doesn't need to be replaced, or no, need to replace that, mark this household down for 3. And imagine the platform you then have to distribute nets when we now know we need 268,420 nets to achieve universal coverage. And the country director, I can't hold up 2 hands easily here, but the country director, a very talented guy called Robin Todd, who worked for Concern Universal, held up 2 hands and said on Skype on a video call, that's the number of nets that we think have been misappropriated out of 268,420. And that's because his team did a fantastic but simple job of doing it right. The pre-distribution survey, therefore, is absolutely critical. When you hand out the nets, it's rather like the situation here where you have a series of chairs with the health workers from the district and the local area sit on this side. And you have 6 chairs, typically white chairs, they're always white, sorry, that on this side with the village leaders and the community leaders. And in the middle is a desk with the beneficiary lists that have been printed out. And an individual behind that desk, when somebody comes up, they get handed 2 nets or 3 nets. The single most important thing to do at a distribution is have somebody standing here who is an independent supervisor, i.e. he's not from the area and he's not from the health system. And that individual, he or she, makes sure no show, no net. So if somebody comes up and says, oh, don't worry, I'll take the nets for so-and-so, that doesn't happen. They have to turn up to get the nets. Or later, they go back under lock and key, and they can come later if they're in the field or they're out driving and they can't come on a particular day. But the vast majority of people can. And importantly, when we've got 200, 1,400 nets left over, they go back under lock and key. Now, out of the 450 HSAs in this particular distribution, 90 to 95% are, as you would imagine, honest, upstanding, hard-working, wonderful people. And you know where I'm going with this. 5 to 10% only are not, or at least succumb to the temptation that is totally understandable, that if you walk off with a bale of 100 nets, that to us, we buy for about $300 now, $3 a net. They used to be 4 or 5, and now they've come down. Competition, number of nets going up, that's a good thing. they can sell about they can sell that bale of nets for about $8,900. They can sell them for about $8-9 a net in the black market. Their monthly salary is $150. 6 months' money in one bale of nets. So unless you have the right supervision in place, guess what? Their nets go missing. And we had 20,000 nets worth of documented attempted theft across the first 200,000 nets, 10%. And that was with all the work we'd done with gathering information about the households and the supervision. So it is absolutely critical that if you don't want these nets to go missing, you have supervision in place. Post-distribution surveys are a mechanism by which we then want to know that the second most important thing that could go wrong doesn't go wrong. The first most important thing is that nets go missing, they get stolen. We have to use the word misappropriated because it sounds better, but it's theft to you and me, and it means that people aren't protected. The second thing we don't want to have happen is that the nets get distributed and they're not sustainably used. Because if we came back 12 months later and found that 50% of the people or 40% of the people were using nets, I mean, I'd tear my hair out, because that means that 50 to 60% of the people that we're trying to protect are not protected. And it means that they now can be bitten, it means that the blood pool that is malaria infected increases and continues. We're not starting to break transmission. So it is extremely important that we get 80% and above coverage on a sustained basis. And that's really the sort of the golden mark. We head for 90 to 95%, so if it slips back, we can encourage, because we can't control, we can encourage intervention. So post-distribution surveys are done every 6 months. 5% of the households are visited, and we ask a series of questions about net condition and whether they're being used or not. And what we see from that information is that nets are being hung, they are being used, they're not missing. It's been extremely positive in Ntcheu, and I think it all comes back to involving. It's really simple. It's not common describing anything that we need Andrew for in terms of nuclear physics. It's going in and liaising with the community leaders, not rocking up and saying, "Hey, we got nets," to map back a lorry, but nets are coming. How many do you need? We need to work with you to do it. And the whole malaria sensitisation and education process occurs, and it fundamentally underpins the results that we then get, which is we see malaria decline. And I haven't updated this rather guiltily for 2013, which I should have done, but I'm making a point here with this graph. There is seasonal malaria in this part of the world. There's a rainy season, and the rainy season is the red line at the top. Last year's in black, 2011 I should say, and 2012 is in green. It tells a really powerful story that malaria has come down by basically 50%. And in any health setting on a scale, you reduce something by 50%, that's dramatic. And we've also seen consistent data about net use. I don't know if you can see the green numbers down here, but net use is 90% after 6 months and 85% after 12 months. Some of the settings in which nets are used are challenging, and they get torn, they get ripped, and they're unusable. So there is going to be a decline in the number of nets out there. What was particularly pleasing was that almost 90% of the nets are in very good condition, which means fewer than 2 holes up to 2 centimetres in size. In thatched huts and really quite basic dwellings in many cases in this rural district. You wouldn't get that in most urban settings, frankly. I don't expect you to read all of this, but this is an example of the 6-monthly survey, and we have 37 health centres in Ntcheu, 37 rows, and we take 250, I think these were about 200, this was a 6-month survey, 200 households are visited, as I explained, and we gather this simple information, it goes into a database, and we provide this to the district health officer, so that the DHO, who's got limited resources at the district level, can decide how he or she is going to use those district level resources. And where would you focus them? Well, you'd focus them on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 out of the 37 areas that have a net is present but not hung. So we've got an average of about 85% hang up. In the other districts, the average is 95. And you get the net usage up, because there might be some reason why that particular community of 7,000 or 8,000 people or whatever it is not using the nets as much as others. So it's not a case of you distribute the nets and it's all done. But if you don't have the data, you don't know whether to direct resources. And this alone, we believe, is an extremely important, probably one of the most important factors in keeping net use up. Because the communities know we're going to be back in 6 months to go to a random number of houses unannounced. Clearly not without permission to enter, but we're not going to let you know in advance. And so the data we get is good. We also gather, we look at information on what's the condition of these nets, and basically we want to see lots of green, and this is an example where in Ntcheu again where we see very good results. So we're seeing the decline of the nets. We expect over the 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, 4 years, we're going to see a decline in the very good and the okay, poor and the not usable at all. And we want to know, where is this particular location on that schedule? Is it doing okay or better than, or do they need remedial action? So, taking a few minutes to look at the nets that we're about to distribute, we had 2 major distributions on the go as a result of this increase in the amount of money that came into us in the last 2 years. I'll start with the one at the bottom, which is Sierra Leone. We had offered to fund 3.1 million nets, which is about $10 million worth of nets, for a 3.4 million net campaign in Sierra Leone, which some of you might be able to picture as sort of bottom left in Africa, on the bit that sticks out. And that's a major contribution. And the 2 things that the short story, because I can't give you the long story, and I have to think very carefully about what we make public about the long story, is that the 2 things that were important to us was being able to verify the nets got to the right people. The second thing that was important to us was this post-distribution follow-up. So we were in a position to share with donors and others and anybody who wants to know the nets continue to be used. And let's just say that we couldn't reach agreement on that, which absolutely sideswiped us in terms of, you're kidding. They had 300,000 nets promised, and many of you have heard many stories, I'm sure, about how there's a lack of funds and so on. So we turn up with $10 million and say we'll fund the lot, we'll fund the rest, because the distribution to the nation had already been delayed 6 months. It was due to happen in May 2013. We were aware there was a gap in February or March, and immediately came forward and said 1.5, 2.2, and as money came in, 3.1 million nets. And we expected things to move forward without too much of a problem. The distribution was put back to November 2013, so there was time once we had come in to organise the micro-planning and get everything to happen. And again, it's a long story, but various partners in country that advised the Ministry of Health, within which the National Malaria Control Programme sits, didn't accept our offer. And we won't fund nets, or can't agree to fund nets. We were asked to fund nets, in other words, just send us the nets and we'll do the rest. And we said, we can't do it unless we can agree on how we're going to know where these nets go. And there is a problem with misappropriation of nets and with the lack of continued use of nets. So unfortunately, we were not able to reach an agreement there, which has delayed us allocating funds to nets. And the Global Fund have stepped in, and they're funding the nets. And I think the least contentious phrase I can use is that the requirements of the Global Fund are not similar to ours. And we think it's a great shame. But in particularly because probably one of the most efficient and effective people I've ever met is this lovely lady called Beatrice down here in the blue, who's one of the most impressive people I've ever met in terms of, boy, if I ever wanted anything done, I'd give it to Beatrice. Her description of bringing every faith together, including everybody, all of the community leaders, this is how you get things done, was very different from some of the other organisations we've come across who believe in a much more unilateral dictatorial approach, if you like. So it was a great shame we didn't get to work with Beatrice amongst other people. We're looking at 700,000 nets to Senegal, and again we're in the phase where we're talking about these two things that for us, whilst we do not wish to be flexible where we can be, we hold dear the idea of knowing where these nets go. I mentioned Ntcheu earlier, and if I skip back to Ntcheu, one of the districts near Ntcheu is called Balaka. I forget what, I think it's down here. And one of the facts that we can say about Balaka is that they needed 200,000 nets. This, I suppose, is an example. What I'm giving at this point is an example of the challenges you face in aid, and there are choices you make as an organisation as to, are you going to fund things and fling nets at things, or are there certain things you want in return because you're concerned about the efficacy of what you're doing? And I mentioned earlier how increasingly more cynical I've become over the last 7 or 8 years. In Balaka, there are about 400,000 people. A little bit less than that, 370,000. They need 200,000 nets for universal coverage. The Global Fund funded 130,000 nets that would go into that area. We offered to fund the difference and do the same in the rest of the country. It wasn't accepted because our requirements in terms of data weren't accepted. 130,000 nets were purported to arrive in that district. We knew in advance that at least a third of the people in that district would not have nets after 130,000 nets came in, because another 60 or 70,000 were required. So we went to the National Error Control Programme and said, we'll fund the rest, and we'll bring those in with our partner Concern Universal. We'll distribute them. No money required from you. We'll fund all the net costs, all the non-net costs, all the shipping costs, all the follow-up costs. We'll do it all. We had $1 million, $1.25 million from one of the founders of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg's roommate, very kindly gave us $500,000 last year, $1 million this year. And we said to him, look, we want to put some money into non-net costs, not from the general public, because we want to keep that 100% bit going, because we think that's a clear message. But if there are opportunities for us to fund non-net costs, because we can't ask Concern Universal to pay $200,000 for non-net costs, they don't have that money. We'd like to use that money. And they said, absolutely, the money we give you, do whatever you like with it, within reason and check. So we agreed to, we received permission to, and that's the right way it should be, we should get permission from the National Error Control Programme to go into that area to fund, to distribute these nets. We went, as you would imagine, to every single household in Balaka, 90,000 households, to count how many nets were there. And we did this 3 months after the Global Fund funded distribution. And the number of nets we found was 69,000, not 130. So we went back again to some of the districts or some of the communities to see whether or not there were nets hidden in cupboards, because it might be that the population said, look, they're coming to check how many nets and how many we're going to get. Put a couple in a cupboard, one under the bed, and we'll get a couple more. That would be entirely understandable, but we've got to guard against that. The one thing that made us think that that is not, well, two things that made us think that's not going on, is Malawians are incredibly honest. They're a lovely bunch of people, and they're very honest people. The second thing is that when we counted the 69,000 nets, we found that only 60% of them were hung. 40% was still in their packages, sitting on shelves. Excuse my French, but bloody useless. So, and we suspected this, and that's why we did this household level survey. The household level survey cost us $15,000. In comparison to what we were doing, what we were finding, nothing. When you talk to the big organisations, impossible, too expensive, can't do it. I don't agree with that. And we've done it in a number of locations. So what we had going on was we're going to fund 60,000 nets to complete coverage of the people of Balaka. And now we've got to fund another 70,000 more. It's another $200,000. In fact, we've just had 150 distributed as we speak, not literally as we speak, but over the distribution started 5 days ago. And what happened to the 60,000 missing nets, we now know. But I wouldn't want to be, I say this confidentially amongst you here, because I don't have court-level evidence for this. You never do. 40,000 nets were shipped across the border to Mozambique. The shipping company was a company called Moody Brothers. They're now bust. They were very friendly with the previous regime in Malawi. $200,000 worth of nets, gone. Somebody's pocket. And of the 90,000 nets, remember what happened in Ntcheu and what we thwarted? 20,000 of the 90,000 nets that arrived were taken by the health service workers, because there was no real control, there was no supervision. So that means you've got half the population. The sleeping space coverage, if you include the 40% that are hung, you can run the maths of 65 times 70 times 60%, I think it is 27% sleeping space coverage. And that, to me, is why I'm so cynical about so much aid. Because there isn't this attention to the really important detail, which is who are you actually protecting? And all of that money from all of those donors, your taxpayers' money, has gone into the Global Fund, which I think is a really important organisation, and a functioning, effective Global Fund is really important. But my experience with them is, over 8 years, through many organisations that have spoken to us, is this is the challenge we have, which is why we have these 4 things that are very important to us when we conduct distribution. We make public the distributions that we're looking at, because we want to share with people what's going on. Because it is not the case that people will give us some money and will be allocated tomorrow. Some of the money we've yet to allocate we've had for a year, in part because of what's happened in Sierra Leone. But the choice is, do we spend it and think, you know, there's loss and there's a threshold and let's just get on with it, or do we not? And that's a very difficult decision to make. But some of the decisions recently have been in the easy camp because we've really not been sure what might happen. But there are a whole series of distributions that we're looking at. Our progress has been decent, and we're making a contribution. Almost 500,000 people involved in some sort of fundraising, and that's not donating, that's making donations, that's actually doing something. North of 20 million, very high repeat donation rate, which is a metric that Andrew and I look at, and others involved as trustees and charity look at very carefully in terms of do people continue to trust us, how are we communicating with them. Influencing national malaria control programs is one of the things I mentioned at the start when I said it's not about money for us. I mean, it isn't, but it's not about can we become a $100 million charity. It's can we change the way as we perceive it, and I'm sure we still have a lot to learn and people to talk to and to adjust our thinking in certain areas. I'm sure that's the case, but we definitely feel as though when it comes to do the nets get to the right people, and can we follow up on those nets and their usage and data surrounding that, that's really important. And we've had some success in influencing some national malaria control programs, less successful